Today, going to cover the leg press. This is probably a little different than what most people have, but I don't want to take up the other ones because the other few that they have at this gym are a little bit more of your standard leg press with the sled, so we'll just use this basic one for now since nobody uses it anyway. It's the same principle setting up for it. And then we're also going to cover the leg extensions. Okay, so just a couple of things for quads today, but I want to emphasize spending a little bit more time on how you're setting up for your quad movements, because a lot of people have issues with this, whether it's knee pain, targeting the quad effectively, or maybe you need to target your hamstring and your glute a little bit more and you're not doing that effectively through your leg presses, so we can set up for that. Now, we'll start off with the most basic movement here, which is going to be a bilateral leg press with both legs, targeting the quads. Okay, you'll notice I have this platform really far back. Obviously, if this is a sled, you're going to start at a higher position, or if it's something like this is stack loaded and that's all you have access to, you'll probably want to start it out a little further than this and adjust the seat if you can. But for me, I can just move this forward to get into it like that because we have no weight on this. I see a lot of people talking about emphasizing the quad by putting their feet very close together like this. And that's okay, but the problem that a lot of people have, especially men, when you do this, is they end up coming back, and you can tell I'm slipping forward because I don't have the mobility here with my feet this far close or this narrow to actually get my legs to come around my torso. So all of this tension right here is really through my hip and my low back. Okay, there's a little bit in the quad, but it's not very much. So what we want to do, for most people, again, some people will be able to come back in this position. Women or someone who's very small and very light, you might not notice that issue, but I always like to start people a little further out, about shoulder width, okay? And that will allow you, if I come back, to come back on the outer side of my torso with a lot more depth, and that creates knee flexion, where the knee is going over the toe and creating more tension through the quad, okay? Next thing with the feet is going to be your placement in terms of height on the pad, okay? So if you'll see, I have my feet pretty low on the pad here, on the plate. Make sure that it is as low as you can possibly go comfortably for quad emphasis. That doesn't mean you have to go as low as possible, because some people will find that when they go as low as possible, you know, let's say the plate goes down further and I'm down here, that when I come back all the way, I get almost a shearing force on the knee because that patellar tendon is being overly stretched, and it's actually doing more harm than it is good because I can't properly move through the movement with that pain, and obviously it's causing issues at the joint that we want to avoid. So comfort is kind of key here to an extent, right? So come down as comfortably as you can while still being able to get those legs outside of the torso and create a sense of knee flexion where the knee is over the toe. If you did want to target the hamstrings, a little bit of glute more, and still have some quad involvement as well, you would put the foot higher on the pad to emphasize that hamstring. We're getting a stretch here through the hamstring and almost driving more through the hamstring here than we are with the quad. But for now, we're going to focus on the quad and keeping the foot placement lower. Last thing I will mention for now with the feet is that some people will find it more comfortable to keep their feet close to vertical. Some people will need to come out at an angle, and this is going to vary per person. There's no hard set angle, okay? But one key thing to remember when you're finding what angle you want to place your feet at is that the knee should always path out over the toes. When you come through the movement, your knee should not go in and it should not go really far out, okay? You shouldn't exaggerate movement in either way. You should just have the knee pathing normally over the toe without any exaggeration. So if your foot is overly rotated, you might think, oh yeah, this is great. I can really get my legs around my torso now. Well, it's not exactly easy to keep that knee over the toe in this position without involving now pretty much all adductors. So we want to find a position that allows you to target your quads effectively, but not stress the knees. That's the goal of what we're trying to do now. And it's, again, going to be very individual. The way that I find is easiest to do this, if you stand in place and you just jump a little bit, and then you naturally find where your feet land after jumping 5-10 times, you kind of know how your normal stance is. Take that stance on the machine. That's what I find easiest, and that's what I find has worked for me in the past. So I end up having an angle about like this for my feet, where they are slightly pointed out as low on the pad as possible. And then when I come back through the movement, the next thing we're going to focus on is your hip placement. We want the hip to be pinned down and tight against the pad of the machine, okay? We don't want any movement through the hip or the low back. You will at times have a little bit of lift, especially with heavier loads, where your butt's going to lift off the pad. That is the point where you want to drive the other way, okay? For a lot of people, that's not necessarily going to be this crazy depth, especially to start, because not everybody has the flexibility to be able to get into a position where they can keep those hips locked, but bring the knees back as far as they possibly can to actually get maximal depth out of this movement. The point being that maximal depth is going to vary person to person. You're not just going to have some benchmark that you can try to hit depth-wise. You need to figure out what works for you and then progress it from there. That's something I want everybody to remember on any movements that I show in these videos, is that progression is not just reps, it's not just weight, it's not either of those things just increasing week over week. It's an improvement to your execution and your capabilities within a certain movement that allow you to perform better in that movement. So reps, weight, absolutely a totally fine progression path. Execution of the movement is a third and underutilized, in most cases, progression path for most people. A lot of people will just keep doing the movement wrong or suboptimally for years and progress the weight and reps, and then wonder why they aren't getting the progress that they could. And then some of those people make, they pay attention to their mistakes, they end up correcting that form, and then they see the craziest gains they've ever had, because now they're actually progressing a pathway more so than just the minor progressions they might take from a weight increase or a rep increase. So pay attention to that. But at the outset, when you're just getting into these things, make sure that you don't push it too hard and you know where your personal limits are, okay? So again, now that we've got the hips locked now, and the feet placed correctly, slightly angled, you're just gonna bring the pad back, okay? Now the upper body here, you'll notice I come forward a little bit. That's because I'm bracing through my core. You shouldn't be limp. You can move the upper body, but your core should be tight. You should be tense in the core to brace your body through the movement, okay? Especially as you're using higher and higher loads with this, that bracing becomes important. So brace and then let that weight come back as far as possible. For me on this machine, it's about here, okay? And then drive out. Now, another thing I want to touch on here, where we are moving away, you don't need to lock the knees here. I see so many people do this. Every time I see this, I want to go over and stop people from doing it. I don't, because people hate it when I tell them anything in the gym, but don't do this. Don't be this person who is going to buy yourself a one-way ticket to Snap City the second you have too much weight on here and this knee decides to go. You don't need to do it. If you think this is full range of motion because you're locking out, you are wrong. Even if you are right, by textbook definition, I don't care. I want you to maintain tension here to here. That's as far as you need to go. I'm not locked out, I'm here, and I still have tension on the quad. Well, not now because I have no weight on this, but in theory, I would still have tension on the quad, and I'm not locking out at the knee. And then we're just coming back from that position. Now, you also don't want to just fly through the movement and pump the weight, because if you're not locking out, some people do have a tendency to mentally just want to pump the weight here, where they're just kind of throwing it back and forward off them as quick as they can. What we want to do is come back slow and controlled, and then press through, stop the momentum, stop the movement and remove the momentum, return. Rinse and repeat. That's it, and that's all you're doing here. So that is how you would set this up for a quad biased leg press, okay? But again, if you are wanting to do hamstring biased movement here, you're gonna put those feet a little bit higher up and probably a little bit further out as well, okay? Now coming back, now this is, again, not the greatest machine for it, but if you're used to a standard sled leg press, then when you come back, you'll notice that you're not going to be able to get as much depth without those hips shifting out. So you'll almost come to more of a 90-degree angle here for most people. And when you're doing that, you're going to put all the tension here through the hamstring, slightly in the glute, and even a little bit in the low back. That's just where you're going to be engaging here. Now, the movement doesn't change. You're just going to press through. You'll just notice your active range of motion decreases a little bit because you've raised those legs up. You can't get as much range of motion here because now you're stressing the hamstring rather than the quad. And you are driving through that hamstring and the quad rather than solely through the quad, okay? It's just a little bit more emphasis for the hamstring there. It's not this crazy movement that I would recommend to grow your hamstrings, but if you're someone who has very weak hamstrings and very overly dominant quads, you could implement this as your leg press variation so that you don't build more quad than you need to, and you put a little more emphasis on the hamstring. For most people, standard leg press is fine. Now, the other thing to touch on here is single leg variants. I almost never use a single leg hamstring biased leg press variant, so we're not going to do any of that. But for the quad, a single leg press is super useful. One, because most people, when they have an imbalance in the legs, it's going to be between quads. It's kind of like people who have imbalances with biceps or triceps. It's just someone favors their strong side and they put a lot more drive through that just passively, even if you don't notice it, on bilateral movements. So if you do need to even out that imbalance, or if you want to work more adductor, the single leg press is incredibly useful because the single leg press involves more adductor since we are now not coming out to the side of the body, but coming straight back head on towards the torso. Since you are set up at a position where your legs are open and your hip is shifted a little bit, you can come back straight towards the torso, and you can see I still have great depth here. In fact, I literally just bottomed out the machine. So I could probably even go a little further here. You also will notice I'm keeping my foot a little more vertical here rather than rotating it out, because here, when I'm coming straight back towards my torso, I don't need to rotate out to get the leg around the torso, so my foot can stay vertical and my knee can still travel directly over my foot in that linear path that we want without going too far out or too far in, okay? Now, this movement will also involve a little bit more glute and hamstring just because we are using more of the hip to help stabilize through the movement. But again, this can be a useful variant if you need to work out imbalances in the legs, or if you want to do a quad biased movement that also involves more adductor and a little bit more glute as well. So useful movement, but again, same principles for this when you're setting up as far as keeping the foot low on the pad, making sure to get maximal depth, okay, and bracing in the core when you're pressing out, not locking out, and then returning. That's it, okay? Pretty simple. Not everybody has a leg press that allows them to set up for a single leg press effectively just because they might not have this open area around the machine. Some people are blocked off where this is in a little further and you can't really set up for it. That's fine. It's more of a specific exercise I would use to target weak points anyway. For 95% of people, I would say, maybe 80% of people, I would recommend just using the bilateral leg press because you don't need anything else specific, at least not in the leg press itself. We could address those things elsewhere with maybe a split squat or even other squat variations like a Smith squat where we want to really emphasize the quad there and then do like a hamstring press here. The biggest thing I want people to remember here is keep that knee tracked over the foot. Okay, you want it to go over the toes specifically. Don't go out too far, don't come in too far. Keep the core tight and make sure that you're getting depth. And actually, while we're on that topic too, I will say something that might help a lot of people here is when I say brace, I notice a lot of people, they lock in here on the handles, they get tense. Their whole body is tense, and they're tense through the hips, from their head down to their hips, through their toes, they're tense, okay? You don't need to be tense up here. I can brace like this and still be relatively relaxed up here. I'm braced right now, okay? And it's not going to cause me any issues to be loose up here while I'm moving this, okay? We want all the weight to be supported on the feet and the lower body. The tension is being driven through our feet, through the, obviously, leg, and then locked into the pad at the hip. That is a crucial thing to keep in mind. If you're tense through the whole upper body and then down through the legs, something a lot of people will notice is they get less depth because they aren't relaxed enough to be able to let their body allow them to get to this kind of a depth. So instead, they're tense and they're maybe coming to here instead of there, okay? So you can get a little bit more of an active range of motion by just acclimating to the movement and becoming a little less tense and just not being so stressed going into it. So relax a little bit, take a deep breath. I know, a lot of people get plate fatigue or plate anxiety, when they have to load a leg press or any heavy squat or quad movement up, because it's like, hey, this is a lot of fucking weight. Don't worry about it. Lock in, okay? And relax through the upper body, other than your core, brace there, and let the weight come back. And that's it for this. We will move on to the leg extension here in a second. Okay, so now we are on leg extensions. One of the other staple movements, probably the secondary staple movement people will do for quads because it's the primary isolation movement that we do for quads. So setting up for this, this is probably one of the more complex machines for most people because there's the most pivot points on this. So to start off, your back should be comfortably supported. I don't want to see you all the way back, and I also don't like seeing people who are so far forward that they have this huge gap here under their legs. So what you want to do is line your knee up to this pivot point. So you'll see that the machine pivots right here. My knee is aligned with that pivot point. So I am pivoting at the same point as the machine. And then just adjust the ankle pad around that. For me, I like to keep it a little higher. Some people like to rest it more on top of the foot. It's personal preference, but I like it right about there, okay? That's all you need to do. Don't overcomplicate the setup for this because it's really simple. Now, as far as upper body and torso positioning goes, some people will say lean back because it gets you this larger stretch on the quad. I don't agree with that. I brace in the same way that you would on the leg press or pretty much any squat or quad movement, and we're bracing and pushing through it. Now, the number one thing I see people screw up on leg extensions is they are kicking the weights. It's how they're moving it. When they're kicking the weight, it's people just sitting here and doing this crap. They're throwing their whole body into it and kicking the weight up, and you don't want to kick the weight. We don't need you to kick the weight. It's not doing anything for your quad. So for your quad and actually emphasizing the quad rather than just throwing as much weight as possible up, I want you to envision that you are scraping your shoe along the floor and flexing the quad. We're not moving that weight by kicking. We're just engaging the quad, okay? That's it. Now, through the movement itself, now that you're not kicking the weight, a cue that I like to use to get people to actually target the quad effectively and to help them stop kicking that weight up like that is you're trying to roll your quads towards each other, okay? So imagine you have, I don't know, you put your hand here. You're trying to pinch your hand. Obviously, I'm not going to get that close. My quads aren't that big yet, but you're trying to pinch your hand in your quads, okay? You're trying to get as close as possible with your quads without actually moving the leg, just by flexing through the quad, okay? And by contracting the quad. Now, here, you'll notice I am going to full lockout because that's just how this movement works. We don't need to stop short of it. We can go to full lockout and be fine here because they're not putting a ton of tension on the knees if we're doing this properly. But you also don't necessarily need to pause at the top. I see a lot of people do that where they're pausing and holding at the top. There are applications for it. It can be worthwhile. If you're moving too quickly and you are a person who just kicks like this, then yes, taking a short pause is fine to remove the momentum and come back down, but you don't need to stay up here forever. You're not just trying to hold this here. It's not some ISO hold you're doing, okay? If you want to do that in your last rep, fine, whatever. I don't think it's necessary, but you can do it. When you're coming down into the stretch, okay, this is where other people have a lot of issues with their knees. If you have knee pain when you are letting the weight rest before you go into your next rep, you're likely overstretching that patellar tendon like we talked about on the leg press. So you might just need to adjust this a little bit so that your feet aren't under the seat as much and you're ending a little bit sooner. Eventually you'll work up to the point where you can fully stretch into that position, and that's what we want. We want the most stretch possible. Remember, we're not kicking the weight, we're engaging the quad. That's it. Don't overcomplicate it. It's really, really simple. Now, another thing to keep in mind here, the same thing we talked about on the leg press, is keeping your hips anchored to the seat. On this, because you're not having the weight come back at you and you're actually pushing the weight up and off of you, you'll probably need to pull yourself into the seat a bit to keep that hip engaged and locked into the seat, okay? And on this movement, the foot positioning. Some people will advise that you pull your toes back towards you. Some will say point them out. I say do whatever's comfortable and do what you feel better with in terms of comfort, in terms of limiting any pain or limitations you might have through the movement, and in terms of how much you actually connect with your quad and how much you actually engage. Whatever you prefer, do that. As long as you're getting the other core components of this movement down, you're good to go. Remember, the crucial things, start to finish, adjust everything, lock your hips into the seat, make sure the feet are comfortable, you're in the full stretch, kick through, and roll the quads together. This entire time, the core is braced, and I'm making sure that I'm stable through the hips and the upper body. That's simple. Easy. Nothing more to it. I think that about covers that one. Next week, I think we will probably cover some hamstring work. We might also get to some back work. So, like, subscribe, stick around for next time.